this out of the way, and let's try to start taking some notes over chapter 1, 2, and 3. Now it says 8, but our test is just a 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to hit the highlights, and you can follow me along with these notes that you downloaded off my website. All right, chapter 1, very little in chapter 1, but a government, a democracy should provide certain things: national defense, public goods, police force, and safety. It will not do something like it will not affect a state's constitution, and so on. The other thing on chapter 1, linkage. Excuse me. Linkage links you with the government, so if it asks you a question, it would be something like, give an example, and it would be like voting or a political party, an interest group, and something that links you to the government. And let's see. Hopefully I marked now. If I added a little something to it, I tried to make it so you could see. Let me see. I did this right there. Now, so you know that I stuck that in there. Now, majority in a democracy, the majority rules, but it should respect the rights of minority, and that is a fundamental element of our democracy. And as we go on, we're going to go down to chapter 2. In your notes, we're going to go all the way down to the Articles of Confederation. We need to know the weaknesses. And we know that if you can remember the 13, meaning that there's only 13 people in the government, so that means there's no executive branch, no judicial branch. It could not force states to pay taxes. It had a very small army. It could not control trade, and so on. So remember that. Now, the Shea Rebellion, only thing you really have to remember, I believe, is that this is one example of how the Articles of Confederation was not strong enough. So we need a stronger federal government. That farmers grouped together and started stopping the banks from foreclosing. And this was kind of like a rebellion. And if it wasn't for George Washington's personality, you know, that they could have marched on the Capitol and probably taken over. So it definitely showed a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Now, I'm going to turn my page to James Madison, who was the author of the Federalist Paper 10. Now, he was concerned with factions. Factions, we would call those interest groups, small groups of people. Some of them are rich, some of them are not rich, but they all forms little groups and tries to influence the government. And Federalist Paper 10 wrote against it, and he thought setting up a republic would limit it to an extent, but factions would be a natural thing, but that form of government he proposed would limit it. And then let's go on down the page here. All right, political equality. Remember that only the House was directly elected by the people. The Senate was elected by the state legislature, and the president was indirectly elected through the Electoral College. Now, Madison's plan was based on separation of powers, and that the majority population would be limited who they could vote, how they could vote. Hope you can read some of my shorthand. And so those are the two things that came based his plan. Also, he had a plan to separate the powers, and we'll go over that when we get to the chart and checks and balances. Again, we'll go over that when we get to the chart. We'll save that. Now, and when the Constitution was finally approved in the Constitutional Convention, it still needed to be ratified by the states, and there was a fight between the Federalists, who supported the Constitution and the anti-Federalists who opposed it because it did not have a Bill of Rights, personal freedoms. This is when the Federalist Papers came into being, and they were papers written to try to convince people to support the new Constitution, and they were proclaimed the most profound writings on the Constitution at that time, and probably even up to today. And okay, and chapter 3. Let me turn my page. I'm kind of following along with my notes too. You need to know the definition of federalism. That is the type of government that we have. This type of government is all the powers in the federal government, and this type of government over here, all the powers in the state. So we picked one in the middle, federalism, which gives some power to the states and some power to the federal government, and some are shared. Okay, hopefully you can follow some of the drawings I've got. All right, the Supremacy Clause said that the law of the land was the Constitution. The Constitution was the law of the land, the highest thing in the government. And then after it, the federal laws, and then after that, the state laws. Now, the powers of the state was set up in the 10th Amendment that set up what we call reserve powers, powers that only the state has. For example, only the state can ratify a constitutional amendment or from the beginning the Constitution itself. So, supreme law of the land is the Constitution, and reserve powers are set up in the 10th Amendment that give, it says, the 10th Amendment says, the state has all the power not given directly to the federal government or denied the states. All the rest of the powers are the states. All right. Looks like this is a little bit confusing, but let's go through and kind of walk through it. All right, the Maryland case. Maryland case is where state tried to attack a federal building, and the state and the federal government, you can't do that. So case resolved. And the importance of this case, as you follow the arrow, is that it set up what is called implied powers. Powers necessary to carry out a constitutional powers. For example, I got air pollution. You know, the federal government has the power to protect the public, and so it can pass laws about air pollution, which is misspelled, air pollution. This is also called necessary and proper. You know, passing laws that are necessary and proper to carry out a constitutional law. It's also called the elastic clause because you take a law or something and you can stretch it. Now, enumerated powers are powers that are actually listed in the Constitution. For example, the power to declare war is in the Constitution, so it is an enumerated power. It is also called implied powers. It's also called express powers. Powers that are expressly listed in the Constitution. Now, there may be mentioned a Madison case. A Madison case set up the right for the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional, and this is called, through the Madison case, judicial review. They can review laws and treaties made by the branches of government. And this is the first time, the Madison case was the first time that judicial review was ever used. So that's why it's important to us. Okay, kind of to end up, full faith and credit is that every state must recognize the public laws records of all the other states. And we have an example of that. All right. Now, dual federalism is when the federal government has his own responsibilities, state has his own responsibilities, and they very seldom ever cross each other. And cooperative federalism is when the state and the federal government work together on a project. Now, we are moving from a dual in the past to now we're moving to a cooperative federalism. And the example about the cake will never be on any test, so don't worry about that. Only our book has that, so it won't be on any AP test. All right, another federalism that you may need to know, and then we have some grants. And the first grant is when the federal government gives the state money for a specific project, like interstate highways. And it has a lot of strings attached to it. Remember, we talked about if you're going to get the money, you must have seat belts, you must pass a law that babies must be in some kind of special seat, and so on. Okay? A formula grant means grant based on some type of percentages, incomes, or something like that. Something, some kind of percentages, some kind of is based on your income or so on. Okay, block grants are something the state likes because it gives you a large sum of money with very little or no strings attached to it. And you can use it, you can be flexible. You can't do everything, but it says we're going to give you a grant to improve transportation. Well, you can move that around to mean a lot of different things. Okay, and here we go. Last two things. Hang on. Separation of powers. That means that we have three branches of government, and each branch has its own power. The legislative branch passes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. And that the president cannot vote on law, the Congress cannot interpret laws, and they're all separate. They have powers, but they're separate. So that's why they call it separation of powers. All right. Now, the other one is, the arrows are the ones, these are called checks and balances. Checks and balances is when you give one branch a power and you give another branch a power over it. For example, power to pass a law is balanced by the veto vote, and that's balanced by they could override the veto vote. Now, your test is going to ask you, I think there's 2 or 3 questions about examples of checks and balances, separation of powers, or federalism. All of them are based on the same thing. They're looking for things like, the president can nominate a chief justice, but the Senate has to approve it. The way we elect members of Congress, they serve in Congress, but they're elected by the state, and so on. So you're looking for things that have a balance to it, checks and balances. So when you're looking for answers in that. And I believe that's all there is, and hopefully that helps you. And let me wait just a second. I've got to turn it off.